Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we're on lesson 9 of Paul's first epistle to Timothy, and we're covering 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 through 16. This one's called Wisdom for Widows. Once again, as this is a pastoral epistle, Paul continued in his discipleship of Timothy by instructing and encouraging the young pastor how to deal with different people in the church. In the previous chapters, Paul told Timothy about the qualifications that pastors should have. Part of this was to prepare Timothy down the road when it was time to ordain other men as pastors. And in addition, it would help Timothy to assess the young men in his congregation who may have some of those attributes already. To prepare them, Timothy could help those young men to address the required characteristics that were lacking. Likely, Paul had done this same thing with Timothy. In addition, Paul shared these characteristics with Timothy to ensure that Timothy understood those godly characteristics that would be required of him as he led the church in Ephesus. Next, Paul instructed Timothy in similar fashion concerning deacons or elders, the men who would work as servants to the church and would fill in the gaps, allowing the pastors to spend ample time studying the Bible, preaching, and praying. Interestingly, there also were qualifications for these deacons as well as for their wives. These qualifications may seem almost too specific, as people are uniquely different. But even though God created us all to be different, and at the same time, there are certain characteristics or attributes in a person that are more helpful when dealing with others. A church body is comprised of many different people with many different personalities and with many different strengths and weaknesses. These instructions from Paul were not just designed for Timothy, nor were they only designed to meet the needs of the church in Ephesus. These instructions were God-given and included in the Bible to fulfill the needs of the churches from that point forward. As I've stated many times before, the church has changed much since the days of the early church, and most specifically since the days of a single and unified doctrine being taught, as the leaders of the early church were the apostles. Today we can enter 100 different churches and hear 100 different doctrines. It is not always easy to find the right fit, even when looking for one that emphasizes the Bible above everything else. In today's passage, Paul will venture into other categories of people and give Timothy and us instructions concerning the godly interactions required between the pastors and the congregations. Let's read today's first passage. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 through 2 says this: "Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, with all purity." Don't forget, Timothy was a young pastor and was called into a fairly diverse congregation. Certainly, some of the people of Ephesus were young, but there also were older people in the congregation too. I mentioned a situation in a recent study of a time when the pastor of the church I was attending appointed his 22-year-old son as the assistant pastor. Our church actually met in an elementary school auditorium, and a group of us would get there early and set up the auditorium for the church service, and it usually took a couple hours of hard work. After the service, similarly, we would tear it all down, load a trailer, and another person would take everything back to a rented storage unit. The 22-year-old son never had been there to set up the church or tear it down, but as soon as he was named assistant pastor, he was there to lead both of those events. He told everyone what to do and when to do it. It is pretty easy to see how his heavy-handed instructions were received by a group of older men who had been doing this every week for years and didn't need any instructions. But another part of this included the fact that when leaders lead by example, it is much easier to follow them. Roll up one's shirt sleeves and go to work. When he saw me carrying a heavy object alone, he could have said, "Let me give you a hand with that," instead of telling this older man what to do next, participating instead of barking orders. Imagine the different response he would have received if his father, the pastor, would have instructed him in the same manner that Paul instructed Timothy. It wasn't long before many of those men volunteering no longer volunteered. This passage also makes me think of the interesting dynamic in the book of Job, after the righteous Job is hammered in his work, in his personal life, and in his health. First, Job's servants and livestock were killed. Next, all of his 10 children also were killed. And finally, Job's health completely deteriorated. Job's 3 best friends came and, at least at the start, commiserated with Job. But very quickly, they started taking turns piling on, attributing Job's difficulties to sin in Job's life that he had not repented of, though they had not witnessed any sin. They assumed that God was punishing Job for sin. And with the level of punishment, the sin must have been egregious. In many similar situations, they could have been correct in their assessment, but they spoke with authority, though God had given no authority or knowledge to them. There was a 4th man, a younger man named Elihu, and interestingly, his assessment was both correct and encouraging. But Elihu sat through hours and days of these speeches from Job's friends, maybe months, before saying a word. Why? Out of respect for their age. Elihu patiently waited, even though he had the right answer, simply because at his young age, he was offering his respect to the older men, and he let them go first. In fact, he let them speak until their lips were exhausted. Elihu did not admonish these 3 men for their incorrect blame cast at Job, but by speaking the truth, Job finally was able to hear some truth after growing self-righteous in his self-defense. Paul told Timothy not to rebuke an old man. Instead, exhort him. Understand the difference. Rebuking someone is to criticize them sharply, while exhorting someone is to strongly urge someone while using positive reinforcement. Think of the old phrase that one draws more flies with honey than with vinegar. As believers, one of our greatest callings is to love one another. Certainly there are times when rebuking is necessary, but for a young pastor, coming down hard and heavy on people who are much older and have much more life experience. If they're mature believers, they likely have walked with Jesus for more years than the pastor has been alive. But at the same time, if that pastor has been called by God into that role and position, as Paul previously mentioned to Timothy, let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. It's a balance. And we can see that Timothy was called to treat the older men with honor, and in turn, they also would treat him with honor. But treating others well is not just reserved for this age difference when respecting elders. Paul encouraged Timothy to treat the younger men as brothers. This might have been a little bit easier for Timothy, as they spoke each other's language and had similar life experiences and maturity. But at the same time, Timothy likely had a more mature walk with Jesus and could offer the similarly aged men wonderful advice on walking with Jesus, seeking wives, and being the spiritual leaders of their households. Paul also encouraged Timothy to treat older women as if they were his mother and treat younger women as if they were his sisters. After all, we are family in the body of Christ. So many churches have been destroyed because of the relationships that occur between pastors and women in the congregation. Paul did not discourage Timothy from having any contact or relationship with any of the women in the church, but pastors and elders should treat those women as if they are mothers or sisters, not with lust or wanting to develop any personal closeness. That personal closeness is reserved for their wives. Let's read our next passage. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 10 says this: Honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents. For this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. In one time, we can see that the church took care of its own, rather than having government-run welfare programs. In 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Paul wrote, if you don't work, you don't eat. And in this statement, we also can understand the harmful nature of feeding laziness. We have another variable added to the equation in our current culture, is there are many single mothers who are not widows. Don't overlook God's covenant of marriage and design of that marriage. Jesus gave one out, as he stated that the only time divorce was allowed was in the case of sexual infidelity. But again, Jesus would prefer that people forgive each other and remain married rather than divorcing, even in that situation. After all, we have been unfaithful to him, and he's not divorced us. But in our current culture, we likely have as many unmarried mothers as married ones. And many of those unmarried mothers have multiple children with multiple men, and none within a marriage. Are churches supposed to support these women? Based on this passage, I don't think so. The saddest part of this is that it involves children who had no part in creating this bad situation through their sin. But the unmarried mothers did put themselves in those situations, and especially if they did this repetitively. The unmarried fathers are equally at fault, and perhaps more so for not supporting their children. Notice that Paul also differentiated between younger widows and older widows. Older widows no longer have the ability to work, while younger widows could work to pay their own way, or at least supplement their needs by working. Paul also specified the differences between those with families and those without families, as it was expected that the families would take care of their own. That means when dad or grandpa dies, the children and grandchildren can take care of the woman who once took care of them. Let's look a little bit more closely at this part of the passage. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. Taken into the number means that they have been added to the list of those who are being taken care of by the church. Remember, the original 7 deacons had been appointed by the apostles in the early church because of a disagreement that arose when the Greek-speaking Hellenists complained that their widows were not being taken care of in the same manner that the Hebrew-speaking and formerly Jewish widows were. Paul stated clearly that widows under 60 should not be included. Once again, this is because they could work, but it also was expected that they would remarry. Remarriage was allowed after a spouse died by the Old Testament law. Paul also stated that another requirement was that the widow being supported by the church could only have been married to one man. Today, there are many more marriages that end in divorce than in death, regardless of the vow, until death do us part. Once again, we live in a dark world, and many people will attempt to take advantage of the church because the people in churches typically have more love, empathy, and concern for others than others we meet in the world. But beware of the ones who are trying to take advantage. Through a scripted, sad story and an always present handout. Certainly everyone has a story, and it is worth taking the time to hear it. It is godly to help others, and in many situations, it also is godly not to help others. Be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. Let's read the last passage today. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 11 through 16 says this, "But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows." Before discussing this passage, we need to remember a very special young widow by the name of Ruth. In fact, the Old Testament book of Ruth tells us about 3 widows. Naomi moved from Israel to Moab with her husband Elimelech, and the couple had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Elimelech died, making Ruth a widow, but she still had her 2 sons who could work and provide for her. Those 2 sons both married, young women from Moab, Orpah and Ruth. But sadly, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And then there were 3 widows. Near destitute, Naomi decided to return to her homeland in Bethlehem and encouraged both of her daughters-in-law to remain in their homeland of Moab. Orpah decided to stay, but Ruth could not be talked out of going with her mother-in-law. Ruth not only became closer with Naomi, but Naomi also instructed Ruth about Jehovah, the God of the Jews. When the 2 women arrived in Israel, Naomi encouraged Ruth to go to the farmland of a close relative who was a wealthy landowner there by the name of Boaz. In the Old Testament law, God instructed the Jews to leave the corners of their fields unharvested, and this was to allow widows and other poor people to harvest enough food to eat. Once again, here's an example of a young widow who was able to work, and in so doing was able to keep both herself and her older widowed mother-in-law alive. God had another plan, though. In time, Boaz fell in love with Ruth, and Ruth fell in love with Boaz. Though he was not her closest relative, he was next in line. By God's law, the nearest relative was called to act as the kinsman redeemer of the widow, to pay her debts, and to marry her and supply for her needs. As a first step, Boaz went to the closest relative, and he was unable to fulfill the duties of a kinsman redeemer, likely because he already was married. Boaz married Ruth, and they had a son named Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, who fathered King David. So Boaz and Ruth were the grandparents of King David, and Jesus would come from their ancestry. This process pointed forward to Jesus, who would become the kinsman redeemer of us all, paying our debts. Take this story into account as we discuss this passage in 1 Timothy. This passage began with this statement, "But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry." The church was not to supply the needs of the younger widows. And it also stated that when the young widows grew wanton against Christ, they also would desire to marry. Wanton is not a word we hear often anymore, and many will confuse it with the name of a Chinese dumpling, but it describes reckless behavior without having any cares or concerns. This behavior is common with young divorced women today, bar hopping, online looking for hookups, and often, if they've had children, the grandparents become the primary caregivers of those children because they're too busy. First of all, these women typically have fun on their minds, and to supply their financial desires, they may have another husband in mind as well. Young divorced men typically are not much different, but as they are typically accustomed to being the breadwinners, they continue to work, as they often must pay alimony, child support, and have to make enough money to pay for their party lifestyle. It is interesting that Paul described this behavior of the young widows as growing careless and reckless against Christ. On the other hand, that is not the behavior that we witnessed in the life of Ruth. She remained resolute in her support of Naomi, her mother-in-law, and having just learned about the God of the Jews, she began following him with her heart as well. God blessed Ruth for her godly behavior, giving Ruth, the young widow, a husband, blessing her with a son, and blessing her family by adding Ruth into the ancestry of the coming Messiah. That is really interesting based on this passage. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 1 through 4 says this: "He who is emasculated by crushing or mutilation shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. One of illegitimate birth shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you." Why does this verse not discount Jesus from entering the assembly of the Lord, as he was related to a Moabite? There were many more than 10 generations between Ruth and Jesus. There were 4 generations from Ruth to King David, and according to the genealogy in Matthew, there were 28 generations from King David to Jesus. The Jewish Mishnah also stated that this was a ban on foreign men trying to enter into God's covenantal relationship with the Jewish people, not a ban on the women. Tribal and Jewish identity were passed down through the father, so through Boaz, not Ruth. Interestingly, to move to Israel today requires either being the child of a Jewish mother, having at least one Jewish grandparent, or being the spouse, child, or grandchild of a Jew. But what we should notice is through God's grace, he added a Gentile into the ancestry of Jesus. Paul added this common behavior of young widows, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. This is not uncommon behavior for any Christians who at a young age endure the death of a loved one. We have a way of doing the same thing that unbelievers do, thinking that because God is all-powerful, he could have done a miracle, and if he really loved us, he would have kept our spouses alive. We overlook the fact that the world God created was perfect, and we changed the world entirely when we added sin to the picture. Evil will happen because of the sin that opened the door. God is not a puppet on our string, where we get to control him by what we want or when we want it. Instead, God sees everything and has a plan. As believers, we need to learn to honor him and praise him in everything. But Paul noticed a common behavior in these young widows. They cast off their faith in Jesus in pursuit of what they deemed to be more fulfilling. Instead of walking away from Jesus, Paul saw this as a better solution: to remain godly women, find another husband, and have children. Now let's look at these last two verses today. For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Paul was speaking in reference to family members of these young widows. Take care of your own. Remember, even as an old widow, Naomi was returning near the land of a close relative in hopes that he would take care of her and her daughter-in-law. Ruth was not Jewish, but chose to go with Naomi and help take care of her, while Orpah returned to her family so they would take care of her needs. Paul made it clear that it was acceptable for the church to help the older widows, the ones without family, to help them survive. We see many, many verses in the Bible encouraging us to take care of widows and orphans, help the helpless. But at the same time, beware of those who are looking to use the church for a handout, burdening the church, because there would be people who would take advantage of the generosity of the church without any interest in Jesus. Unfortunately, that describes the majority of the families using the governmentally run welfare system. It's a mentality that can be passed down to future generations, having watched their parents and grandparents receiving handouts. The children and grandchildren often see this as what they deserve, rather than with the mindset of working hard and providing for their own needs. It's easy to help the disabled. It also is easy to help old folks who no longer can work. It is not so easy helping capable people who are lazy. It is understandable when they also are mentally limited or disabled, but to continue to support someone who is unwilling to work is not a good decision. In conclusion, remember that Paul imparted his own wisdom to Timothy, because as a new pastor, these situations would arise. Remember, though, that these words of wisdom were not just for Timothy, as these words came from the Holy Spirit, and God ensured they were included in the Bible. These words of wisdom are for us too. Often on social media, application called Nextdoor, I see solicitations from young single mothers wanting money from strangers to pay for rent, Christmas or birthday presents for their kids, etc. Often the same mother will post a message every single month. Quit sleeping around. Quit having babies with men without being married to them. Sin has consequences. And while it is really hard to see innocent children suffer because of the sins of their parents, this behavior is common in our culture today. The first step is to follow Jesus, and the second step is to learn his laws. As much as our churches need to display the love of Jesus, we also need to be discerning concerning the people we choose to help financially, and the ones who we will choose to encourage with advice on making better life choices, beginning with the gospel. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.